right, so good evening, everyone. Even though we can't see you, we know you can see and hear us. We've muted you and blocked your video for now, I'm just going to explain how the evening will go. So good evening and welcome to Exploring Flood Risk and Vulnerability in the Tantramar Area Local Service Districts. I'm Amanda Marlin and I'm Executive Director with EOS Eco Energy. And so while folks are muted, if you do have something that you'd like to ask or comment on, be sure to use the chat box. And if you're not familiar with Zoom here this evening, there's a little sort of word bubble icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen that says chat. If you click on that, it'll open the chat box and you can write your messages or questions in there. You can also use the raise hand function, which is also that little yellow hand at the bottom of the screen, and that will let us know, I think, that you might like to say something. But for sure, use the chat box. That might be the easiest. We're also recording the chat tonight because we've got some folks who aren't able to join us this evening, but who are still interested in the information. And so EOS is recording this for later use, just so that everybody is aware. So if anyone does end up coming, out of the darkness to ask a question, then just know that you may be recorded unless you don't want to be, and we can stop the recording or edit it out later. And so now I'd just like to also wish everybody a happy Tantramar Climate Change Week. This first week of February is Climate Change Week in our region. And so thanks everyone for attending. I also want to thank the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund, and that's the funding that EOS receives to coordinate this week of events. There's a whole variety of different webinars and talks and lunch and learns and things like that, everything virtual, of course, this year. And there's a full schedule of events that's on our EOS website. I'll also put the link in the chat box here shortly in case you're interested in checking out other events going on the rest of this week. But for this evening, we'll be exploring flood risk and vulnerability in the Tantramar area with staff from the Southeast Regional Service Commission. So these are the other two faces you see on your screen here tonight. So Chloe is a planner with the Southeast Regional Service Commission. She has a bachelor's degree in community design and environment, sustainability and society from Dalhousie University. Prior to attending DAL, she received a technical diploma in architectural technologies from SAIT Polytechnic and worked for the City of Calgary's planning department for several years. After experiencing a flooding disaster firsthand in Alberta in 2013, in the floods there, she began to further educate herself in environmental practices, starting to obtain her LEED certification and moving forward to continue her post-secondary education. And then we also have James, and James is the geomatics manager at the Southeast Regional Service Commission. He holds a bachelor's degree in geomatics engineering and a master's of science in forestry, both from the University of New Brunswick. And since 2010, James has been involved in mapping flood risk, considering climate change for communities through Southeast New Brunswick. He's currently involved in initiatives to adapt to climate change locally through the Chignecto Climate Change Collaborative, provincially as a member of the New Brunswick Climate Change Adaptation Steering Committee, and also nationally as part of an advisory panel researching nature-based solutions to reduce coastal and river or inland flooding. So our agenda this evening, before I pass things over to James and Chloe, we're going to start out with a presentation on climate and particular flood impacts throughout our Tantramar region here. Then there'll be time for a question period, and then we will wrap up with Chloe and James giving us a tutorial on a new website that they've developed with information about climate change impacts in our rural Tantramar area here. So I will hand it over to Chloe and James.
Perfect. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks for including us in Climate Change Week. We are very excited to be part of this. So with that, I will share my screen here. Let's see if I do this right. Okay, perfect. So here we go. So we're going to be talking tonight about, as Amanda mentioned, exploring flood risk and vulnerability in Tantramar local services. And just let's get those going. technical issues. There we go. So who are we? We are the Southeast Regional Service Commission, and we're a local land use authority in rural Westmoreland and Albert counties. So if you were to need a building permit or a waiver for an electrical wiring, anything like that, we're the people you would come and see for those kind of things, just to kind of get you an idea of who we are. We're currently in the first phase of a climate change adaptation plan, which we got funding through the Environmental Trust Fund to do. This is all focusing on the rural areas of the Tantramar region. And we're doing this alongside a committee. So our committee includes members of EOS, the province of New Brunswick, Specs Unlimited, Nature New Brunswick, and the emergency measures operation. So we are also building on the work that has been done by the Chignecto Climate Change Collaborative headed by EOS. This is just a map of the local service districts that we are going to be incorporating into our plan. You'll notice that there's kind of some blank areas in the middle there. So the town of Sackville and the villages of Dorchester and Port Elgin all have their own climate change adaptation plan, so they're not going to be included in the scope. Okay, so currently, as I mentioned, we are in the first phase, which is primarily just our research phase. So what we're going to be looking at is going through the background of the rural Tantramar region. So we'll be looking at the demographics, past climate events, and how that has impacted the region and how we can see those impacts moving forward. To do that, we will look at the climate change scenarios and predictions. So that will give us an idea of what we need to prepare for the future. And we have done a vulnerability assessment, which again will give us a better idea of how that looks. And then finally, we'll look at resources. This is also the flow of how this whole presentation is going to go tonight as well. So first things first, what is climate? So the difference between climate and weather is that climate is what you're expecting. So those are the long-term patterns that we're noticing, whereas weather is what you get in your everyday life. Climate is changing at a faster rate, leading to an uncertain future with more extreme weather events. So as we noticed there, that climate change is already occurring with that. Global greenhouse gases emissions need to be reduced, which requires mitigation. Mitigation would be reducing the severity of these effects. And we can take local actions to prepare for these changes, which would require adaptation. So it's the process of changing to better align with the situation of what we're seeing. And what is flooding? So flooding is a naturally reoccurring phenomenon. It is the most costly natural disaster in Canada. And while it is infrequent, it does have the highest cost. There are 3 different types of flooding. One is coastal flooding, which we see that as storm surges, sea level rises, dike lands, and tides. In this area, the tides within the Bay of Fundy, and as well as the Northumberland coast. And inland flooding. So inland flooding has various factors. This includes precipitation, time of year, and the land cover. Occurrences are also influenced by the tides and ice jams. Impacted areas we see include roads and dams. Overland flooding isn't something that we'd be looking at, as those typically happen in more urban settings, because it has to do with, with like back of the streets and stuff. So this is just a picture of the Sac City Gale, which is the largest documented flood event, which happened in 1869 in the region. And this is kind of the benchmark flooding event for what we're looking at. So these are just some pictures within the Tantramar region showing what what can happen in these events. So you can see there's the highest annual tide and how close that is to the train itself. There was some erosion on a roadway in Tantramar, which completely took out one side of the road, making it unusable, and some flooding at Carter's Brook, making your way into Sackville, and that kind of just shows, again, unusable, cannot access Sackville when it's flooded like that. So next, we're going to talk about the projections, risks, and impacts of climate change and what that looks like. So rising temperatures is the first point that we're going to hit on, and that, with rising temperatures, we see heat-related illnesses, we see higher invasive species coming into the area, we see impacts on agriculture and fisheries, and there is a higher risk of forest fires. We'll also see a look at increased precipitation, which will increase flood risk. This also means that we're going to be seeing less snow and more rain, and also could mean increase in drought at the same time. Increased frequency and severity of storm events. So in this, we're going to see more intense storm events more frequently, and that's going to be causing more damage. And then finally, sea level rise. So all of these projections that we're going to be talking about in the next few slides are based on the worst case scenario, which are at what we call the 8.5 levels. So all of the data was obtained from the province based off the work done from the Northwest Regional Service Commission. So here we have a look at what the average annual temperature is. So currently we're sitting at about a 6.93 for 2020. Again, this is based off the worst case scenario. So we're looking at an increase of up to 10.88 at 2080. Just kind of to break that down seasonally, this is what that would look like. So we get the winter on the top two and the summer on the bottom two. So we're looking at about a 4-degree temperature rise within these seasons. This, of course, also leads to more days with higher temperatures overall. So our days with a maximum temperature is that where it's above 30 degrees. Currently, we're sitting at 2.8. And in the worst case scenario, in 2080, we could be looking at up to 35 days, so a whole extra month of days over 30 degrees. Next, we're just going to take a look at precipitation. So here we have 1,242.9 for 2020, 1,325.4 for 2080. So we're looking at a change in 100 millimeters. Again, this is showing more annual precipitation, which means less snow and more rain because of the rising in the temperatures. So since the 1950s, we've seen increases in the largest precipitation events. These have gone up 71% since then. And that's with the change of the temperature in increasing this kind of precipitation. Just kind of a breakdown of how that looks seasonally. And then finally, this will increase our growing season length. So if you're a farmer, this is mostly good news because that means you're going to get some more days where you are able to do your work. So in 2020, we're looking at 199 days, and we could be seeing up to about 262 by 2080. This also is good news if you're an invasive species, though, because now that our temperature is changing, this adds more days where they can come in into our area, and we're more vulnerable to that. So the two scenarios that we'd be looking at, the first one is similar to the 2010 flood that we had. The flood level at that time was at 3.7 meters on the Northumberland Strait. An equivalent storm in the Bay of Fundy would see a level of 9 meters. The reoccurrence period of that is currently at 1 in 20 years. So this will become 1 in 5 by 2050 and 1 in 1 by 2100. So in other words, currently we're at a 5% chance of this happening any given year. It'll go up to 20% in 2050, and then we're at almost 100% chance by 2100. And the second scenario, again, comes down to the worst case scenario. So we're looking at a 4.3 flood level rise in Northumberland Strait with a 9.8 in the Bay of Fundy. The reoccurrence period for that is 1 in 100 and 2100. And this is kind of what we look at when we're doing our planning, just because that gives us an idea to make, so we're prepared for the worst case scenario. This takes into consideration everything that we have to look at for those plans, and then it helps us create our sea level rise bylaw that we currently have as well. And James is going to take the wheel from here.
Great. Sorry. Well, thank you, Chloe. So I'm going to be talking about now is how we've conducted a vulnerability assessment for the area. The goal of this vulnerability assessment is to identify different assets that are risk of flooding, and then to classify each asset from kind of a low to a high vulnerability scale. So the assets that we're looking at are roads, culverts, buildings, properties, and wells. So when we assign the vulnerability scores, we're not only looking at if this asset is flooded or not, but we take into other considerations. So for example, for roads, we'll give a road would be more vulnerable or at a the consequence of road flooding is greater if it's a major route. For example, that would be cut off to for emergency service measures, and it would be less important if it's a local road where there might be an alternative route to access that area. And then we would also consider the depth of flooding. So again, using the road example, if the road only has a couple centimeters, the risk isn't as great as if it's got a meter depth and couldn't be crossed. And as I'll talk about later, we've really focused on coastal flooding for a number of reasons. Thank you, Chloe. So to conduct the vulnerability assessment, the first thing we need to know is where the floodwaters would be. Again, we're considering climate change, so we can't assume where we had flooding in the past would be the same as where there'll be flooding in the future. We're fortunate in New Brunswick that there's this report produced that provides sea level rise estimates for all coastal sections of the province. So from this report, we're able to establish elevations for the sections in the Northumberland Strait and the Bay of Fundy and the Tantramar area under those 4 scenarios that Chloe talked about. So the current day 20, and the current day 1 in 100 flood event, and then again what those 1 in 20, 1 in 100 flood events would be in the year 2100. So once we have those elevations established for the coastline, we can map how far inland that would go using LiDAR data. And for those of you who aren't familiar with LiDAR, it provides really precise elevation information across all of the province. So every square meter of the province has a very precise elevation that we can use to map the flood extent. And then we collect information about the location of roads, buildings, etc. And then we put all this information in what's called the geographical information system. So we put the flood extent, the different assets, and then we can conduct, create flood hazard maps and conduct the vulnerability assessment. Next slide, please. We took a similar but different approach for inland flooding. The province of New Brunswick has just developed methods for very precise flood hazard mapping for our inland areas. But when we started this project, that mapping, those methods weren't developed yet, which are also very time consuming and difficult to apply and across the entire region, such as the rural Tantramar. So what we used was what's called the hand method, which is a method approved by the Natural Resources Canada and their flood mapping series, and is appropriate for rural areas. So what this allows us to do is establish, kind of in very simple terms, a relationship between the depth, the area of the catchment area of any given point along the stream. So if you're at in a flood depth, so for example, if you're at the very top of a stream, right where it starts, you would have a very low depth. But if you're at the mouth of the Tantramar, you'd have a much deeper depth. So using these methods, we were able to map the flood risk at the in the entire Tantramar region. And this, while this gives us a sense of what the flood risk is, which is great, it also underestimates the risk because this only maps the natural floodplains. It doesn't account for other factors that really create the greatest risk, as we've experienced in this area, due to inland flooding. So that's flooding resulting from precipitation largely. So for example, it doesn't account if you have a large precipitation event that also occurs during a high tide, which would cause water to back up. It doesn't account for culverts that are blocked or then back up behind the road or the culvert or ice jams or other dynamic factors that would extend beyond the natural floodplain. And in our mapping, I guess the good news is that there's been almost no development in these floodplain areas, even accounting for climate change. So really the rest of this presentation will really focus on the coastal vulnerability. So here's just a map putting it all together. In this map here, the kind of the bright blue areas are areas where there's only a coastal flood risk. The light blue areas further inland are the inland flood risk. And then the areas that are dark blue are areas where there's a combined factor of inland and coastal flooding. So these areas would be considered the most at risk because they would experience both areas. Now this mapping, you'll also notice in red, these are the location of the dikes. So these dikes do protect against most of these flood events. So the areas behind the dikes would experience less flooding. It's also important to map these areas in case of a dike failure or a very large flood event that could overtop them. So so here's just a summary, showing some of the impacts across the entire Tantramar area. Then later on, we'll show you some tools to understand the impacts locally or in different regions. But for example, just to give you a sense of the risk, so this is looking at the 1 in 100-year coastal flood risk today, or in the 2010 scenario, and in 2100. So in the current risk, there's about 233 buildings vulnerable to flooding. That increases to 815 by 2100. It's also important to note that it's not only the number of assets. You don't only need to look at the number of assets, but also need to keep in mind that the depth will be could be as up to a meter higher under the 2100 scenario. So these initial 233 buildings would be even more at risk. And this is all summarized in the more detailed vulnerability assessment in the final report. Again, there's about 2,000 properties vulnerable. That increases by 300 in the 2100 scenario. We'd also looked at wells that would be overtopped. Increases, it almost doubles from 80 today to 153 in the future. This doesn't include some other impacts to wells that, such as if there could be saltwater intrusion into wells, which is another issue. And currently there's about 80 kilometers, and this will could increase. There could be another 30 kilometers of road impacted under the future scenario. So that was the vulnerability assessment. And before I hand it back to Chloe, I just wanted to mention, this gets more into an adaptation option, but there's been a lot of work being done recently trying to understand the value of what are called natural assets or the natural environment as providing benefits to communities that have flood protection properties. Coastal wetlands are starting to be understood as providing a lot of value to both minimizing coastal erosion and can also decrease the severity of large storms as they can slow or attenuate or lessen the waves as they pass over the wetlands in comparison to a paved or grass surface, for example. So what we've done is we've identified, this is just showing a stretch on the Northumberland Strait, the wetlands shown in red, the coastal wetlands shown in red here, have the greatest potential to provide flood protection value to the buildings and roads behind them. So it's really important that these wetlands are maintained. And unlike on the Bay of Fundy, where there's a sediment source that can help these wetlands, coastal wetlands, rise with the tides, these wetlands need more land to grow inward as the tide rises. There's not a sediment source that can help them rise up. They will need to expand inland for them to exist and continue to provide their benefits to the people in this area. And inland wetlands also provide a similar function for reducing inland flooding as well. Okay, Chloe, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, James. So with that, we'll talk a little bit more about the adaptation approaches for the Tantramar region. So one of the ways that we can do this is by utilizing zoning measures to reduce development in high-risk areas. Currently, there is a rural plan in the Tantramar region. Within that plan, we do have 3 zonings: the conservation zoning, the coastal zoning, and the agricultural dikeland zoning that do kind of touch on this, as well as some policies and proposals on climate change and conservation. However, this document is almost 10 years old, and the amount of changes that we've seen just within the last 10 years goes to show how much more that we need to be able to do and add into that. So that's why we're kind of taking a head start at it now before it's reviewed next year. Another thing we can look at for adaptation is protecting and restoring natural landscapes. So as James mentioned, with the salt marshes and dikes, those are ways that we can help with the long day. Those are ways that we can help with protect against flooding. We can also look at implementing natural stormwater management systems such as rainwater barrels and some drainage plans and alternatives that we can look at as well. And finally, we can look at some renewals and upgrades to infrastructure in the area. And now, how can you help? So one of the things that we have done is we have created a survey that will be available after the presentation and for a few weeks after that, just because we really value your feedback. Like I said, we're currently in the research phase. And as James mentioned, there's a lot of information that we're kind of missing with some inland flooding aspects because there's no data for it. So getting your input on events that you've seen or know about, that really helps us to help plan for adaptation measures for the future. Other ways you can help is by implementing adaptation measures within your community. There are resources out there which will also be provided at the end of this as well that you can use today and again in the future while we work through this plan. We are currently waiting to see if we can get funding for the second phase through the Environmental Trust Fund, which will be the actual action and adaptation phase. So that's another way that we'll be able to help you so you can learn those measures to implement them within your community. And finally, to stay up to date on climate information. So there will be a number of websites that we will provide as well that will have the most up-to-date information on what's going on with the climate data. So here's just kind of a brief list of the resources. Again, this will all be made available and there are some more on the website that we will be showing you after. And that concludes the presentation. So I'll leave this open for anybody who has any questions and I can kind of circle back to the slides. So we can go ahead with those. I have never used the chat function within sharing, so I don't know if somebody else wants to read the questions and then we can go through those.
It doesn't look like there's any questions yet. So if anyone, we can just give, if anyone's typing like mad right now, we can just give a minute for someone to type in their questions, or you can use the raise hand button and I can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, we've got somebody raising your hands. I will just unmute you.
Okay, I have a question. What does a meter of rise in sea level mean to a property on the Bay of Fundy?
So I guess it means 2 things. I guess it depends first of how, you know, what type of coastline it is. So if you're a low-lying area or a cliff, so if you're, you know, especially it's particularly worrisome if it's in a low-lying area, because the 1 meter vertically of sea level rise could translate into quite a large distance inland. So there's, and it could also include increased erosion. But then also
I'm on the Memramcook River.
You're on the Memramcook River.
Yeah.
We'll have a chance to look at some areas in particular in a minute. So depending if you're behind the dikes, those would offer some protection.
Yeah.
But maybe we could park that question and we can have a look at that area using some of the tools on the website that we'll go over in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so there's some questions that have come in. You mentioned that the flood plan is a bit outdated. Do you know if this is the case in Sackville and Middle Sackville? This is from Jane and John. So I guess, so I'm assuming this is within the Sackville municipality. I know Sackville is looking at updating their sea level rise bylaw, but we're really focusing on the rural areas at this time. Um, but yeah, that's all I can speak to that on at this time. And we've got another question from Julia Campbell, who asks, are there any known resources to help people who own property within a high flood risk, or could you see this being implemented in the future? Cleanup will be expensive when areas flood.
Yeah, I think for that, that's kind of a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. The province has come out with some resources, kind of there's like pamphlets and brochures that kind of look at how you can work at flood-proofing your home if you are already in one of those high-risk areas. And from our standpoint, we are going to be looking at ways that we can incorporate that into the plan moving forward and the steps that we can take between our jurisdiction and the province as well.
So the next question is from Steve Riddlington. How does your project align with recently announced funding for studies of Bay of Fundy dike risk analysis for infrastructure between Sackville and Amherst? That's a good question. I'm not sure if you're referring to the transportation corridor study. And if that's the case, that's looking at how they're looking at options to improve the transportation corridor to consider climate change. I don't have much information on that, but this project is independent of that. Amanda, I don't know if you have an update.
No, there's no update from that study yet, but we're supposed to hear something in the spring. And so maybe there'll be some media coverage at that time.
Oh, and just following up with Jane and John, yes, so it'd be best to check with the town of Sackville. Or if you want to contact me, I can provide you some information. And yes, and okay, well, if there are any other questions, please raise your hand or type them in. And if not, we'll turn it back to Chloe, who will go over the website that we're developing.
Let's give that a minute there. All right, so with that, I will go to our website here. All right, so this is our new Tantramar Climate Change Adaptation Plan website. So what we have on here is some information for you as well as some resources and ways you can get involved. So just kind of to walk through it really briefly, this is the cover page, which kind of goes through who we are, what we're doing, what this involves. We have a section here on climate change information. There's a lot of maps in here, so there's a lot of data, so it might just take a minute to load. But so here we are. So this goes through kind of general information on climate change, and then breaks down into other sections. So we have, again, the warmer temperatures, days above 30 degrees, the change in precipitation patterns, the sea level rise, and how this data is compiled. So just take a look at those. We have some mapping on here that will give you kind of a live version of it. Sorry. Oops. Okay. We'll go to this one. So this one will show the buildings that are affected by sea level rise and storm surge events and flooding. So once that initializes here, we're actually able to punch in an exact location for it to tell us. So if you can look that up at home if you want to look at a specific attraction or area that you go to, or just where your house is, just to see what that looks like. So just to get a little closer in there, you get to see what the mapping shows. So the blue is the areas at risk, and then the red dots are these specific areas. So Fred, we can take a look at that for you here now, just to show that as an example. So
I'm across the river from your map.
So you're on, okay. Perfect, yeah, so we'll kind of zoom in a little further there, but you can see similarly, James can probably provide some more information on that as well.
So if you wanted to, this map will be made public once we've finalized a couple details with it. So you'll have a chance to explore now, but so you can hold off, or if you'd like us to look up, zoom into a particular area, you could, we could try that out now if you wish.
Okay, so move your map down just a bit. No, sorry, move the other way down.
The other down.
So we're in Taylor Village.
Right there.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, you're in Taylor Ridge on the other side of the Memram Cook.
Yeah, we are on the other side of the Memram Cook.
Oh, okay. We've just provided mapping here for the Tantramar.
I see that. We're a local service district, but we're not on your map.
That's right. But if there is, maybe we could follow up afterwards if you're interested in knowing the risk at that location.
I will look over your website first, and if I have any further questions, I would send them to you. How's that?
Okay, that sounds great.
Yeah. Just kind of get an idea. So the slider here shows what we're looking at presently, and then this would be in 2100 for the 1 in 100 year flood. So you can see the difference in there, especially with
my property, my house would not be affected by a flood, but my property would be. I have dikes and an abattoir on the property.
Okay. Yes, actually, the Memram Cook does have or no, it's in the rural area. Never mind.
Local
But yes, we can follow up later if you wish.
Thank you.
So it's just kind of an example of how that map works, just for anybody who is going to be looking at using that as well. It's a similar slider style for the precipitation and the temperature as well. So you'll be able to see what we're looking at currently and what that would look like in 2080. And then we have some descriptions on what the temperature related impacts would be. So we're looking at things like how outdoor activities would change, energy consumption changes, invasive species and different kinds of pests coming into the area, changing flora, growing seasons, wildfire risks. So that breaks that down there. We also have water related impacts. So again, of course, frequency and increased flood risks and the frequency of ice storms. And on here, we just have a dashboard for flood risk. So this will give an overview of the Tantramar region as a whole as to how many buildings are going to be affected, and properties and wells and roadways. So the numbers down here just kind of show this is the increase of buildings affected between 2010 and 2100 based off the 1 in 100 year flood. So in the entire Tantramar region, that looks at 582 properties. And there's a summary tab here that shows you the exact numbers. Same for properties, wells, transportation. In the top corner here, you can change it. So if you're looking for your service district in particular, we can go into that, and then that will give you the information for it as well. Next, we have just some brief overview of adaptation solutions. So that kind of what we touched on within the presentation of where you can take action, what we're looking at. And then you just scroll down through this, and then it'll give you some information on that. Currently under the Get Involved tab, it has our survey embedded into it. So if this is the way you want to go through to the survey as well, or if you kind of go through the survey the first time and you think of any more information, you can kind of fall back on here for some information as well. And finally, there are just the resources. So it's divided up into climate data and information. So these are all the resources that we have compiled for that. And we also have homeowner guides. So this is where you can look at for getting how you can flood proof, if you're building a new building, how you can build for climate change, and emergency preparedness guides. So having your 72-hour emergency kit, all those kind of things. And that is it for the website. If anyone has any questions on that, we can touch on that as well. And this will be going live tomorrow, I believe. So we'll be able to provide a link to that as well to the attendees, and we'll have it available on our website, which is ndse.ca, and it'll be under our planning initiatives.
It doesn't look like there's any other questions or no other hand raises. Oh, here's from Amanda. She's asking, is there a deadline to answer the survey?
Yes and no. We will leave it open as long as possible. We are looking for responses within the next few weeks, preferably by the end of the month is probably when we're going to close it up. The sooner we get them in, the better, just so we can start getting that information in and compiling it as quickly as possible. But we will have it open until the end of the month. And we will be providing paper copies, I believe, as well to some areas. We know that not everyone has access to the internet. So we will be going out and leaving some paper copies at some locations for people to pick up. So if you know anybody who would like to help distribute those to locations, or if you know somebody who doesn't have access to the internet who would like to be able to take part in the survey, just let us know and we'll be able to get those for you as well.
And Chloe, did you have the link to we can put in the chat box to the survey?
Yes, absolutely. Give me 1 second here. Let's put that into the chat here. So there's a link to the survey there. And if you have any questions in regards to the survey, please feel free to reach out to us. If there's anything that doesn't make any sense, or if there's any information you want to add, our email is in there, so you can contact us with that. There is a map on there as well, so you're able to kind of pinpoint exact locations if you know them, or intersections around where you've seen any climate events, just so we have a better idea of where these are all happening.
Oh, we just had a question. Oh, from Fred. Since we're not on the map, do you still wish us to do a survey?
Information doesn't hurt, especially if you're going into the Tantramar region for any particular reason. So just having that information because you are so close does actually help us out as well.
Well, wonderful. It doesn't look like there are any more questions coming in. Amanda, did you want to have any final words to wrap things up?
No, not really. Thank you guys, though, for being part of Climate Change Week and for everybody joining us this evening. And I encourage everyone to take a few minutes and answer that survey. I think that's it. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, it was our pleasure. Great. Yes. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Great. Great. Night, everyone.